Welcome to Humans in the Biological Environment, ENVS 110. I'm Mike Gonella, and I am your teacher for this class. And the main point of this class is to expose you to all the different facets of our world, including human and non-human nature, and also inanimate things like water, earth, energy, all the things that make up our world and support life here on this planet. And then, a warning, most of this class is talking about all the environmental problems that exist on our planet, mostly caused by humans. So I will try to intersperse that with hopeful stories of how we humans have actually helped regenerate the planet too. There's a lot of hope to be gained, but there's a lot of hard stuff to look at too. So that's what this course is about, and we will dive in. Welcome. This quote reads, "Today we are faced with a challenge that calls for a shift in our thinking so that humanity stops threatening its life support system." And this is by Wangari Maathai. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 for environmental work and other things related to that. So I think if you pick apart this statement, and this is all just intro stuff to help kind of poise the class within the bigger topics here, but like what we're doing in this class, not really quite getting yet to the study guide questions of what you'll be tested on, but so take that for what it's worth, but just wanted to give you the bigger picture that humans seem to be, at least Western culture, seems to be kind of out of sync with a lot of our ecological systems. They're not in line, they're not working in concert and harmoniously. A lot of land-based cultures and indigenous cultures have worked well and fairly harmoniously with ecosystems for thousands of years. But our current Western modern culture is not. It's separated, and the way we do things, the way we produce food, energy, consumption, waste is out of sync and going against the very systems that support our life. So we need to get kind of back in line with that. And the one thing that tells you you're out of line, or tells us that humanity's out of line with Earth's operating systems or ecological dynamics, is our environmental problems and breakdowns and disease and illness and extinction, things like that. So we know that that's a problem. And that's what this quote, I think, is talking about. As a first example of how environmental science and environmental studies works and what it encompasses, we can talk about the case study of the Amazon rainforest, which is in South America and covers a very, very large area of a number of countries, mostly in northeastern South America. So it is one of the largest tracts of tropical rainforest left on Earth, although quickly diminishing due to environmental problems like deforestation, mostly clearing of the primary rainforest or the pristine rainforest, taking the trees out for pasture so people can grow food, crops, livestock. Also, roads are being quickly put into new areas that have not been developed, and again, more trees taken out. So all of these trees, the collective forest of trees that are taking in carbon dioxide and letting out oxygen and photosynthesizing and creating lots of biomass there in the Amazon, that is getting reduced. So we are having more and more CO2 being released. It was carbon that was stored in the bodies of these plants and these rainforest trees. When they're cleared, they're usually felled, meaning cut down and burned, or decomposing, but all of that carbon gets released into the atmosphere. So we have more and more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, less and less trees to absorb it, less oxygen being produced. The Amazon rainforest has been talked about as the lungs of the earth, meaning producing lots of oxygen for all of us organisms that need oxygen, that do respiration. So, but there's been a lot of problems and a lot of degradation to the Amazon, and it's continuing. Let's look at the next slide. I'll give you some more details on that. And I'm pretty much just reading off of this slide here, but the world's most important carbon sink mean a place where carbon that's in the atmosphere gets put into storage, either in an organism or the soil, something that takes it out of the atmosphere. So that's the world's most important place that carbon is absorbed out of the atmosphere and put into long-term storage, not in the atmosphere, meaning we don't get buildup of CO2, which is a greenhouse gas. It makes the atmosphere hotter. The Amazon is home to thousands of indigenous communities, all distinct, many with their own language, their own culture, their own knowledge about that area that they live in many different areas within the Amazon rainforest. It could be Ecuador, it could be Peru, Brazil. And those peoples, due to their knowledge and ability to live more carefully and harmoniously with the rainforest, have sustained that rainforest. Now, it is a clear argument that the numbers of those indigenous people are not high compared to others like cities in the Western world. So that is one reason why they can live sustainably in the rainforest. But another is all of their knowledge and their ability to make sure that the resources and the ecosystems they depend upon are nurtured by their practices. So there's a lot of things that we would have to do to slow down the degradation or stop the Amazon rainforest destruction. That would be in reducing deforestation, maybe giving people incentives not to take the trees down, not to develop areas, maybe countries that are involved that have part of the Amazon rainforest in them, that they would have to be given incentives to not develop it and to keep it as rainforest. And it needs to have an international support system to make this happen. It's an international carbon sink. It's a global resource. It's a global support system that all humans need, essentially. So that would be the best way to address it and restore it, is to first stop the degradation and then start the restoration. And there's lots of tools. We have the technology to do things like this. It's not outside of humans' ability to mostly do some, moderate restoration and heal a lot of what we've done. It's just politically and economically unfavorable a lot of the time to do so. So this first lecture or chapter talks about an introduction to all the many serious environmental problems that we're dealing with today. So it is very heavy, I'd say, and kind of negative, focusing on all the bad stuff. Like I said, I'll try to intersprinkle positive, hopeful things too, because there is a lot going on that's positive too. Also, don't forget to, as with this slide, to look down below in the presenter's notes where I put more details and more text in addition to what's on the image slides. So that can help, the text stuff down there in the presenter's notes can help you answer some of your study guide questions and get ready for the test. So we'll also look at the scientific method. That's one way we can gain information about our environment and about how we're affecting our environment. One way to get feedback for how our practices, culture, what we do on the planet, how it affects those systems that support us. And then we'll review some of the fundamental ideas that have shaped the ways we think about our environment and our place in it too, which varies from culture to culture. The United States has its own kind of, in general, stance and kind of way that we look at the environment as a commodity, a resource to use and maximize or save. So seeing it as kind of a thing, an object to either accumulate or not. Other cultures, mostly land-based and indigenous cultures, have different views that are more relational, that are thinking often about the relationship of humans with the land and kind of the back and forth. So there's different ways to look at it, but we'll go over a couple of those things in the rest of this lecture. Environmental science is multidisciplinary. That means that it is a science that involves lots of other science fields, geology, hydrology, biology, ecology, chemistry, physics, economics, finance. It involves so much that because it's looking at a system that's very complex, ecosystems or biomes or habitats that are very complex, and they're complex ecologically, and then you add in the human part too, and that makes them complex in other ways too, outside of kind of just living things. For example, the oceans or fisheries. Think about the channel here in Santa Barbara. Maybe you don't live here in Santa Barbara, but if you do, you know that there's a shallower channel between the mainland, like Santa Barbara, Ventura, and the Channel Islands. And that channel, because it's not as deep as the open ocean past the islands, it is warmer, has more higher rates of nutrient flow, and it, at least historically, has had more fish in it. So that's a fishery, that's an ecosystem, a marine ecosystem that's very complex with different organisms and fish, mammals, plants, algae, bacteria, and the nutrients and the water. And also it deals with economics because there's fishermen. And lots of different systems relate to that too. Finance, politics, so we got oil wells out there too. So it's an example of what environmental science might look at. They'll say in the last 20 to 30, maybe even longer years, the abundance of fish in the Santa Barbara Channel has diminished. So it's going down and down. So that's a problem that environmental science can use as a study to find out why the fisheries are declining. Now, lots of people have studied this. It's not unknown. I'm just giving you an example of why so many different types of disciplines can come into this field. So this slide it repeats some of the same things I said in the last slide. One thing that's new that I'll say is environmental science has its goal to solve a problem that humans have caused to our environment or our ecosystems that we live within. So it starts out as a troubleshooting science, like let's look at a problem, an environmental issue, a problem, and try to gain some data and information about how we might do things differently to make things better. So it has that as its focus. Some disciplines do not have that. Some biology, chemistry, people will study something to know more about how it works, not because there's a problem with it, but just because of curiosity and interest. So environmental science is different. It is applied. It's always an applied science. Also, the disciplines of environmental science or environmental studies and ecology are relatively new. They are disciplines that came about in the late 60s, early 1970s, and are integrative and, like I said before, multidisciplinary and focused on methods to lessen the damage that humans are causing on the environment. One of the most amazing things about our planet is the diversity of living creatures that are here. It's such a vast number of different complex living creatures have come to be on this planet. And that is something, even though each one, like this frog in Costa Rica, a rare frog may not seem like it's that important to your life or humanity. And I think it probably isn't. But we don't know exactly which species are supporting us in indirect ways. And it's that diversity, it's been demonstrated over and over again in science, especially in ecology, that diverse systems are more stable and more resilient and more able to handle perturbations, meaning like fire, disease, earthquake, predators. They are stronger, and that would extrapolate to human social systems. The more diverse we are in our ideas, our backgrounds, our thoughts, the more able we are going to be able to respond to changes in our world and in our lives or our ecosystems. So diversity begets strength in ecosystems. So it is important to protect the diversity that we have on our planet, even the organisms that we may think are unimportant. An environmental system, in its simplest form, can be described as a system of circulation of energy and matter that involves living and non-living components. So all the living creatures, and then the environmental non-living part of that system that interact with each other. For example, like this hydrological system where water circulates through different parts of the environment, the non-living part, like the soil, the lake, the air, the mountains, the rivers that are not considered living, and through plants and animals, microbes. So all that together would be an environmental system. This is a digital image made up trees, soil, mountains, atmosphere, some clouds in there. So this is an environmental system. You've got living and non-living components, and there's some creative art here showing how the tree's roots are actually intertwined and cooperating with their handshake there. But you could look at this environmental system as the movement of carbon dioxide or carbon from the atmosphere into the leaves of the trees and into the roots. And then sugars are made by the plant and exuded and feed the microbes. Carbon can be shared between trees from using a fungal mediary between the roots of different trees, or the same types of trees too. So you could say that's like a kind of like the carbon cycle, but also an example of an environmental system which involves biological system as well. And it's important to know and conceptualize this movement in these dynamics, in these relationships, because it's when those relationships break down that we have environmental problems. And so we need to know how to restore those relationships. That this movement of carbon and sharing of carbon between species has been going on for a long, long time, millions of years before humans were here. The rate and that humans seem to be changing things and doing things kind of in a different way is interrupting some of these systems and causing problems. And those systems, though, provide us with our food and our air and our livelihood too. So conceptualizing all the components and how they interact and how energy and matter flow between them will help us understand where some of the problems of movement of those nutrients and energy and mass are, and better able to maybe fix them or make them better. This slide defines a number of terms that are helpful in understanding aspects and characteristics of environmental systems. If you think back to our example 1 and 2 slides ago of a hydrological system and the forest and the soil system interacting, those are both open systems, as most biological systems are, with organisms in them, where they exchange matter and energy freely between their system and other systems. And read on through the other definitions here that'll help you understand things in future lectures. The tragedy of the commons is a useful concept to understand And it refers to an article written by Garrett Hardin in 1968, in which he described the problem of common property resources. He was referring to the Boston Commons at the time. In the past, in the late 19th century, the Boston Commons, which is now a park, like Central Park is in Manhattan, it's in Boston, and it was just an open area within the city, and different people would graze their livestock and use it for various uses, but no one owned it. It was a common property. So it was not a private property, so everyone used it, and no one was in charge, and it tended to get overused because of that, because there was no restrictions. So common properties still today, like our ocean resources and the atmosphere, they're common. No one owns them and controls their use. So they do over time, especially with our high populations, tend to be overused and exploited to the point of degradation. Now let's move on to the idea of ecosystem services. And this comes straight out of Western culture and capitalistic view of natural resources, that they are commodities and they provide services to humans. So that can have a benefit to look at it that way, because that means if we think of them as providing services, we will value keeping them healthy and strong, those ecosystems, like marine systems or forests, rivers, because we know that they provide things for us. Ultimately, it may, or one of the weaknesses of seeing natural resources or ecosystems as providing services, is we are objectifying them and keep thinking of them as a commodity to use or not use as much, but not thinking about the intricate relationships and maybe more of our responsibility to take care of them for their own sake, not just for what they can do for us. But in environmental science, it's a useful thing to know about ecosystem services, and to think about one of the ways we can get around that weakness of seeing them only for what they can do for us is just to keep expanding the definition of the services that they provide for us beyond the basic things, and then we can get a broader and broader understanding of what they provide for humans and the rest of the world too. So, and here the next couple slides are breakdowns of some examples and types of ecosystem services. The next few slides are examples of major environmental problems and some of the solutions humans have come up with to fix those problems or lessen their negative impacts. Air pollution is a major problem and has been for quite a few decades. This is a picture of Los Angeles, what it used to look like in the early 1960s, 70s, before lead was taken out of gasoline. I think the bottom picture is just a really smoggy current day picture, but it gives you an idea of what it used to look like. People that I know that grew up in the LA basin, either LA or Pasadena, maybe even out to Redlands or San Bernardino, said that they lived even closer to the mountains than downtown LA is. They could never see the mountains. They didn't know there were mountains there. Some people have joked. And now it's pretty clear compared to that, and that was the removal of lead from gasoline at that time. So that was a visible pollutant that was removed, but the invisible ones are still there, and they're still bad, and they're growing with the number of cars and people. Of course, another major environmental challenge we have is climate change, which is being caused largely by human activities, combustion of fossil fuels, adding CO2 into the atmosphere, which traps more heat from the sun, heats up our atmosphere, and makes changes in weather patterns, and melting ice caps and glaciers, and flooding and storms and things like that. So that is all happening, and it's a major topic and challenge, very political, but very real, and it's new, and it affects everyone on the planet. Human population continues to be considered an environmental problem, even though our reproductive rates as human is slowing. We are still adding 80 million people to our planet each year. So it continues to be an issue and has underlies many other environmental issues as a major fundamental problem. Now, air quality throughout the world has in some ways become cleaner in Europe and North America, but in many other countries where they are still in the process of ramping up industrialization, their air quality has gone down and continues to go down. So that overall we have a degrading and increasing air quality problem throughout the earth. And with increasing population, of course, this has been happening for a long time, is the problem of hunger. And global food production is one response to the idea that we don't have enough food for people, but really we do. We've increased our global food production over the past century, but there are still many areas of that are considered food deserts where people just don't have the access to the food. So it's a distribution problem that still plagues us. Biodiversity loss, another major environmental issue that we're grappling with, and that is the decrease of numbers of types of species throughout the world. You can look at the graph and see how all terrestrial, marine, freshwater, vertebrates, non-vertebrates, they're all decreasing fairly rapidly over the last 40 years, 50. Some good news that protected areas, so protecting biological, environmental areas, ecosystems, the number of those is increasing. The bad news, the areas that are being protected are relatively small, as you see in dark blue. It's a small portion of our planet, but at least we can know that there are more and more of them still being added to the protected areas list. The rights of indigenous peoples are being more and more recognized as valuable and needing to be protected and upheld and supported. So that's important as a group of people that have been marginalized, and there has been many instances of genocide towards indigenous people, including our own country's history. But the other aspect of it too, besides just humanitarian, is these groups of people and these cultures often have a lot of knowledge about how to interact with ecosystems and the natural world in a way that is sustainable. It doesn't mean that all indigenous tribes do everything perfectly. It just means historically, and they have gained a lot of information on living with the land and with the resources that are local to them without depleting those resources, because these cultures developed in times when there wasn't access to outside resources. So that kind of information can be really helpful for us going forward, and we definitely want to protect the rights of those peoples and their lands too, for multiple reasons. Good news is we've seen a big increase in the use of renewable resources and the growth in those sectors with wind energy, solar energy, biomass power, and efficiency of the use of all energy sources, and decreasing reliance on fossil fuels is happening. That's important. Is it fast enough? We don't know, but that's good. That's good news, and we're gonna be happy about that. This is a nice little graphic that shows you some of the factors that go into what is considered sustainable or sustainability. There has to be a social aspect to it, an economic and environmental. All those together it's what us humans would say creates the idea of human systems that are sustainable on our planet, that don't compromise the environment or economics or social systems. They're livable, they're viable, they're equitable. That's This is one definition of sustainability, or one way of breaking it apart. In the text here on this slide too, I find this one case here that's described very interesting, and that's about a little bit different topic than sustainability, but it's more about sustainability for other species, not just for humans. And that is the start of some of the legal rights of natural organisms or entities. So read about that. That's where Walt Disney Company wanted to build a ski resort up at Mineral King, the Sequoia National Forest, or right next to it. The Sierra Club brought a suit against them, but in that suit they said that the actual valley, the ecosystem there, had legal standing as an entity. It was a thing that deserved rights to be protected, instead of having to always go back to some kind of human infraction for a reason of starting a lawsuit. And that you've seen that more and more throughout the globe. In Brazil, there were some people that a river, they filed a suit for the river against a dam, a company that wanted to put a dam in, and saying that the river was the entity filing the suit. So it's interesting, an expansion of the rights of all living things. A little bit more about that idea of that non-human organisms and entities have rights. A conservationist might say the forest is valuable because it has valuable resources for people and water, even for other organisms. Someone who might call himself a preservationist might say that it's because the ecosystem is important for its own sake, just because it is. And there's a lot of people that think both are important, but getting that legal standing for non-human entities is new, and I think kind of exciting. This is a nice, concise definition of sustainability. One's from the World Health Organization, and one is even more general. So read about that to get an idea of what that is. This environmental activist, Dr. Maathai, is really interesting and cool. She started the Green Belt movement in Kenya, where she's from, for poor rural women, and to help those poor women restore the environment. And restoring the environment for poor rural folks is like helping those people. It's not just planting trees. That has nothing to do with their lives. It's directly related to their livelihoods, their food sources, all of that. So she headed up that organization to plant more than 30 million trees, and got communities to help determine their path forward for economics security, food security, healthcare security, poverty reduction. And she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 for this work, so it was internationally recognized as groundbreaking. And sometimes these environmentalists and activists are, some of the best ones are the people that come from those places that are affected. Maybe not from the first world where everyone's kind of got it all already and we want to do something good for others. That's important too. But the people that are actually living through the hardship, the environmental hardship, which translates to human hardship, sometimes are the best ones to work in that kind of grassroots community level work and really understand what's needed there. So we applaud her work for sure. The scientific method is a methodical approach to learning about our world. And there are certain steps that are followed when you use the scientific method to try to answer a question you might have about some phenomena in the world. And the steps are here in this cyclical diagram. Usually it starts with some kind of observation. You see something, or a scientist or group of people see something, and they are trying to figure something out. Something doesn't make as much sense, and they want to inquire further, and questions are developed. So this is not even really science so far. It's kind of like what everyone does all the time. You see things, you try to interpret them, the parts you don't understand, you have questions about. If you're going to use a scientific method, you formalize those questions into hypotheses. And a hypothesis must have be falsifiable and testable. So it has to be simple enough that you can test it in this within the scientific method. And then it also has to be able to be falsified, like proven that it's not true. So in general, in science, we can't prove things are true, but we can falsify them. We can throw out things we know are not happening or true. So you formulate those hypotheses, and then you develop testable predictions from those. And then you create and develop an experiment that can help you answer those questions, gather data with those experiments, and then interpret the data to understand what's happening. At that point, you see the little blue and purple arrows. You could refine. You might find out that your question wasn't quite right for the experiment. It didn't capture what you were trying to ask, or you didn't set up the experiment right to answer that certain question or hypothesis. So you could take the data you got and revise it and keep going around and around and in an iterative fashion, and refine the hypothesis and do the experiment again, slightly altered. When you are finished, you can interpret that data, and you develop general conclusions, summaries, maybe speculations about why you got the data you got related to your hypotheses. And sometimes that answers questions and helps you decide which way forward to go. In environmental science, this is done like any other scientific discipline. It is done often as a way to gain information about deciding about land management, species management, different environmental effects that happen from human actions, things like that. So that can help us determine and make policy decisions, management decisions, etc. The scientific method is really popular now, especially in the Western world, as almost the sole means of gaining information for deciding what to do with certain actions for humans. Like, should we, if we're trying to, we notice there's maybe salmon are not as abundant in a certain river as they used to be, and we're trying to just figure out why. We might do a study to find out some of the factors that are decreasing their abundance with the scientific method, and then use that information to help fix the problem. So it is very powerful, the scientific method, and very useful, and it's used a lot. But it does have limitations. The limitations are you can't test anything too complex of a system. If you do, you won't get good results because you won't know which part of the system was really the cause of the results you got. So something like climate change, global climate change, is really difficult to pinpoint because it's so complex. And the scientific method kind of bogs down with really complex hypotheses or questions. So that's one limitation. The other is there are other ways of knowing things rather than just do this methodical testing and hypothesis development, etc. You also just know stuff. I mean, just think about your own life. You have gut instincts that are based on experience. You have emotional knowledge and perceptions, spiritual information. There are lots of ways of sensing and understanding the world and making decisions from that gathered, information that are not following the scientific method. So indigenous peoples, or traditional knowledge, as they would call it, is a form of science. There's a lot of trial and error that's happened especially with species management, hunting, harvesting of plants, it's things like that. But it's not a formal science. And there's a lot of information from those people that just have trial and error, like farmers. They might not run an experiment to see which fertilizer works best, but they might just try a few and see what happens. And it wasn't formalized. They didn't make a hypothesis, but they do gain information about how to go forward. So those are other ways of knowing besides the scientific method. Here are a few terms that come up related to science. and sometimes confused with science and scientific method, but they aren't science. Pseudoscience, bias, misinformation, disinformation, those all are not deriving data and information through the scientific method, but they often are put forward as if they are. Read about these definitions and know them. This last part of the lecture is a discussion and passing along some information just about basic ideas in matter and chemistry, all the nature and structure of the building blocks of all living organisms and the environment. You can use this slide to define these terms: matter, atom, element, molecule, compound, electron, proton, neutron, valence shell, and ion. The way an atom's charge is determined is by looking at the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. It has a charge if there are an imbalance in the number of protons and electrons. So if there's more protons than electrons, it'll have a positive charge. If there are more electrons than protons, it will have a negative charge. The number of protons in each atom is the thing that determines an element's atomic number. That's the key difference that distinguishes different types of elements. So this is the number of protons. It determines the element's atomic number, and that is used to distinguish one element from another. This is the periodic table, and it lists all the known elements and all their different atomic numbers, etc. The four elements that make up 96% of the living matter of all organisms are listed here: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. There are others, that's the other 4%, but the majority you see here is oxygen, then carbon, but hydrogen and nitrogen as well. So we're pretty simple, but just those four can be put together in so many different ways with those other trace elements too, or trace atoms. So we can end up with many, many complex molecules from that small number of elements. Water is a molecule. It's essential for all living things known here on Earth. Perhaps someday we'll discover life forms in other places on Earth or other planets where water is not required, but it definitely is how living things work here. Water, the actual compound of water, is made up of one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms. Each hydrogen atom shares 2 electrons with the oxygen atom. So overall, the 2 hydrogens share 4. And that creates a stable, what's called a covalent bond between the hydrogens and the oxygen, because they're sharing electrons. Those 2 electrons fulfill the outer orbital of the oxygen molecule and of the the oxygen atom and the hydrogen atoms, creating a stable covalent bond. Here's a diagram showing you the electrons that are shared between the oxygen and the hydrogen in the water molecule. In a broader perspective, water is, and its characteristics are important for determining lots of things. Of course, it's important for living things, for our bodily functions, but also things like in the ocean, it regulates the temperature of the planet. It has a high capacity to hold heat. Those covalent bonds between the oxygen and the hydrogens are strong, so that molecule can get really warmed up and excited, hold a lot of energy before it breaks apart. And you know what happens when it breaks apart? Steam. But so the oceans of our world can hold on to a lot of warmth, and that is a big factor in all kinds of things. climate, weather, marine ecosystems and fisheries. So that quality is important to know about. Let's now talk about some of the other molecules that are found in biological entities and organisms. There's lots of different kinds of molecules. The ones that are biological, those are called organic molecules, meaning they're carbon-based, or biomolecules. They're the ones essential to cell structure, function, and they are constructed inside and used in the bodies of living organisms. So there's 4 types of large biomolecules: sugars, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Carbon is prevalent in all of these, and by definition, in all organic molecules. That's different than the food legal definition of organic food. That talks about the way that food is produced so that it's clean and pesticide and hormone and synthetic fertilizer free. It's a different use of the word organic. This just means carbon-based. And to end this lecture, the first introductory lecture for this class, just a brief discussion of photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is absorbed into the plant. It uses the energy of the sunlight to catalyze the reaction of combining the carbon from that carbon dioxide with the hydrogens and from the water that it gets from its roots, and it forms sugars, carbohydrates, that first large biomolecule we discussed. And those sugars can be used for the cell wall, like cellulose, structural. It can also be for storage in the form of starches in the plant. And then also, as you know, the plant takes in CO2, lets off oxygen for other organisms that need oxygen for cellular respiration. That would be animals and other organisms too. And lastly, just combining those two things, think about the photosynthesis, producing the sugars, and that's like if you eat a piece of bread, it has some of the sugars that were produced by that wheat plant or whatever kind of bread you have. Maybe it's not wheat, maybe it's rice flour, but you ingested those sugars, which are the chemical formula C6H12O6 in general, and then inside of your cells, you breathe in oxygen that's needed to help the process of breaking that sugar down into the CO2 and water, but it releases energy that can be used by your body in many places. So that's how those large biomolecules are made and broken down and used in organisms on a really coarse scale.